Check it out.
Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin coming back at you with another video today on Pub Stomp MTG, and in today's video I'll be upgrading the new Duskmourn House of Horror Precon deck, Jumpscare. So this is a Simic based commander deck focusing on a mix between Landfall and Manifest Dread. And I will say I'm not the biggest fan of Landfall, just saying that right out of the gate. I think it's an overused mechanic that I feel like we shouldn't really touch again for quite a while. But I will say there are some things that I do like about this deck. It has that full, but I will say there are some things I do like about this deck. It has the Manifest Dread mechanic that focuses on putting face down creatures on the battlefield, and you'll put stuff into the graveyard, picking and choosing which one you want on the battlefield face down and one in the graveyard, which I will say is pretty neat. But I will say there is two face commanders of this deck that I do want to first talk about. Which one do you want to build around? Do you want to build around Duskmourn or do you want to build around Cayenne? So let's read them. Let's read them both and see what they do. So Duskmourn, Mystery Unraveler for 2 green and a blue legendary creature, human wizard with a 3/3 body. She does have landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, Manifest Dread as this is the first time this ability has resolved this turn. Otherwise, you may put a permanent card you control face up. So again, going back to that Manifest Dread, you're essentially just manifesting the top card of your library. You could pick between the two, and which one you pick is going on the battlefield as a 2/2 face down, and the other one is going into the graveyard. So you have a little bit more flexibility of which one you're choosing. But I do like this in the aspect you could use some top deck manipulation, have a mystical tutor or worldly tutor, and just put a card on top of your library, and then Manifest Dread, and oh my gosh, it's a big giant Eldrazi. So that aspect, Duskmourn could be really busted, where you could just cheat big giant Eldrazi on the battlefield, swing in for the Annihilator triggers, which could be a little mean, by the way. Secondary commander of the deck is Cayenne Corrupted Memory. I almost want to think of Cayenne Peppers saying that name. Besides that point, this is a great tempo commander that focuses on giving things flash speed. So for 2 green and a blue legendary creature, Illusion. As long as Cayenne's power is even, you may cast non-creature spells as though they had flash. As long as Cayenne's power is odd, you may cast creature spells as though they had flash. And whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Cayenne. And she does have a 2/2 body, so you start off with even power. So I like this design. It limits the flash ability just a little bit, where I feel like it's not overpowered. And I would say that's a good route to go around, is casting a lot of cantrips so that you can just draw one card and then switch the power, because nothing's worse than having a creature in your hand and you can't cast it on flash speed, because Cayenne would have a even power. But if you have a little cantrip that's an instant spell, you can cast that really quickly and then go ahead and cast that big creature. But I will say I really do like this design. I like how it's limiting in the aspect of, okay, you need to have a even power or odd power to get one of those effects, and you have a way to do so. Whenever you're drawing a card, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. But since you are going for a Manifest Dread theme, I would say Duskmourn is a little better in the aspect of focusing on landfall, because there's a lot of landfall cards in this deck, and then there's a lot of big creatures that you could just sneak in pretty easily and then just get an extra landfall trigger, and hey, would you look at that, I have a Worldspine Worm just at a reduced cost. So now that I've talked about the commanders, I did want to give you a brief summary of how I do these videos. I first focus on some of the new cards, what are going to help you with your strategy in the game plan. The next up, I'm going to talk about some of the reprints. What are the great reprints that'll help you with your game plan in the deck? Then later on, I'll talk about some upgrades, some tuning up that you can take advantage of in the deck, because there's a lot of things that you can get rid of. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the land base so much, because lands are not really that exciting. If you want to add fetch lands to get those extra landfall triggers, you're more than welcome. They just got reprinted in Modern Horizons 3, so they're pretty cheap, I'll be honest, so that if you wanted to pick them up, you totally could. And so now with that said, I'm going to first talk about some of the new cards of the deck. Let's talk about some of the new cards. The first one I did want to talk about is Glitch Interpreter. This one is a pretty good one, especially with the face down mechanic. So for 2 and a blue with a 2/3 body, it's a human wizard. When it does enter, if you control no face down permanents, return Glitch Interpreter to its owner's hand and a Manifest Dread. Whenever one or more colorless creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So this is good in a Duskmourn deck, or if you want to use it with Cayenne. Mainly because if you draw a card, you can buff up Cayenne specifically, but with Duskmourn, you manifest, and then you have that way of just flipping it if you have that second landfall trigger. So this one's decent in this deck. The next one is pretty good with It Came From the Pipes. I love the name, by the the way. I just think it's very eerie. But this does read for 4 and a blue. When it does enter the battlefield, you manifest Dread twice. Whenever face down creatures you control enter, draw cards. So this is just great with Duskmourn because whenever a land enters the battlefield, you're essentially just drawing a card. Plus, not to mention, when it does enter the battlefield, you're making 2 creatures on the battlefield that are face down anyways, so you're just going to draw 2 cards on top of that. So I like they came from the pipes. It's a little overcosted at 5 mana, but I think it's good in this deck specifically. Following that is a great board wipe with Duskmourn's Hypothesis. So for 3 and double blue, it's an instant speed spell. You may put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, then choose odd or even. Return each creature with power of the chosen quality to its owner's hand, and 0 is even. So this is pretty good, especially with Cayenne specifically, because it focuses on what kind of power you want to have an odd or even. This could also work pretty well in a lot of different aspects. If a lot of people have odd powered creatures on the battlefield, let's just put a +1/+1 counter on some of our creatures to make them even, and then go ahead and bounce every creature off the battlefield and keep ours on the battlefield too. So that's where I see this being pretty good. Following that is Curator Beastie. I like this one because it's basically like a Titan, and honestly the art is pretty cute. I mean, I know a lot of people might find it horrifying, but I think it's pretty cute. It kind of reminds me of Where the Wild Things Are. So let's read what it does. So for 4 and 2 green, Creature Beast, reach. Colorless creatures you control enter with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on them, and whenever it does enter or attacks, manifest Dread, and it's a 6/6 body, so it's like a Titan-like effect. When it enters the battlefield, you're going to be manifesting, and you're going to be putting a 2/2 on the battlefield, but wait a minute, they're going to enter with 2 additional counters on them, so that's going to be very good, especially with Duskmourn, especially when we flip those creatures, they're still going to retain those +1/+1 counters on them. So I like Curator Beastie, especially with Duskmourn. I feel like it's going to be a great fit with her deck specifically. Following that is Disorienting Choice. This is very similar to Attempt with Discovery, but with a little bit of a twist. So for 3 and a green, it's a sorcery seed spell. For each opponent, choose up to 1 target artifact or enchantment that player controls for each permanent of the chosen this way. Its controller may exile it. Then if 1 or more of the chosen permanents are still on the battlefield, you may search your library for up to that many land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So I like this because this can act as removal on one side, but if your opponents don't want to remove it off the battlefield, well hey, you get to put a lot of lands on the battlefield and ramp a little further, and mind you, it's any kind of land you want to search for. It doesn't have to be a basic. So I like this. Disorienting Choice is very similar to Tempt with Discovery, but with a little bit of a twist, of course. The next one I'm gonna have to tilt my head and okay, never mind, I rotated it. Experimental Lab and Staff Room. This is a great room in the deck. This has 2 different modes you can choose from for casting it. The first one does read for Experimental Lab for 3 and a green. Whenever you unlock this store, manifest Dread, then put 2 +1/+1 counters and a trample counter on that creature. And then if you unlock the other side, Staff Room does read for 2 and a green. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, turn that creature face up and put a +1/+1 counter on it. So that's fantastic because of course we have a lot of creatures that are manifested on the battlefield. Flipping them over is going to be great, especially with Duskmourn. Obviously, if we do have landfall triggers happening with Duskmourn, that's going to be very easy, but this is just an added bonus because when we deal combat damage with that creature, hey, we get to flip that too. Following that is Shriekwood Devourer. This one is one of my more favorite cards because I love big giant creatures, and this does big giant creature things. For 5 and 2 green, it's a 7/5 body creature tree folk. It does have trample. Whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures, untap up to X lands where X is the greatest power among those creatures. So I love this in a Xenagos deck because you can double the power of this creature and untap 14 lands. You most likely won't have 14 lands, but maybe you do. And of course, this could combo with Aggravated Assault with many other things that do combo with that card, so there's another addition. This is a simple effective card that I absolutely like. If it had haste, that would be even crazier, but luckily it doesn't have haste. It's very tame. But I like this card. I love the art. It looks absolutely wicked. And lastly, Giggling Skitter Spike is something out of my nightmares, honestly. It looks like that one toy from Toy Story. You probably know the one. Some people have made references to it already. So let's read what this does so that I could get this over with. So for 4, it's an artifact creature toy. It does have indestructible. Whenever it does attack, block, or become target of a spell, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So very similar to like a Stuffy Doll effect, but like a super Stuffy Doll. Plus you can pay 5 Monstrosity 5, put 5 1/1 counters on it, making it a 6/6 instead of a 1/1. Yeah, this one is the stuff of nightmares. This one's going to be very good, especially in those Stuffy Doll decks. A lot of red decks are going to like this too. So yeah, let's just click off this right away because I don't want to have nightmares about it. So those are some of the new cards. Now let's focus on some of the reprints of the deck. Alright, so I'm on the official Wizards website, just looking at the deck list as a whole. There's a lot of great cards to look at in this deck specifically. Some great reprints. For example, the biggest one I would say is AC Tyrant of Gaia Strait. This was up at $30. This has the great ability of playing an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever a land land you control enters, you draw a card, so just more and more lands entering the battlefield, the more card draw you are going to get. Plus this synergizes with Duskmourn with that landfall ability too, so this is an excellent reprint. It's more of a scarcity play, most likely this is going to be $4 to $5. I've seen this with a lot of reprints recently like that. Worldspine Worm is another fantastic reprint. It's just a big giant 15/15 that you can manifest later on if you just put it onto the battlefield as a 2/2 creature. You get that extra land with Duskmourn. Hey, look at that, you have a 15/15 trampler, and if it does die, you have 5 more creatures on the battlefield that you can take advantage of too. So I love Worldspine Worm. It can be a great option, especially if it does die. You just return it from the graveyard into your deck shuffled up, and you can potentially manifest it later on too. So absolutely love this in this deck. Next up is Hydra Omnivore. I love this as a reprint because if you swing with this, you definitely get to deal a lot more damage to your other opponents instead of just that one opponent you're swinging at. Also, this can be a neat combat trick. Say for example, it's a face down creature on the battlefield. You played a land, you manifested Dread. You swing in with this Hydra Omnivore face down as a 2/2. And let's just say for example, you have a fetch land on the battlefield. You crack that fetch land and put another land on the battlefield. And if nobody blocked Hydra Omnivore as a face down 2/2 creature, well hey, guess what? An 8/8's coming towards them, and 8 damage is going to be dealt to each opponent too. So I do like this as a neat combat trick. There are some great synergies with face down creatures. For example, Death Mist Raptor is a great dinosaur. Temur War Shaman is another one. Whisperwood Elemental is another fantastic manifest creature. The next card I did want to focus on that has the heaviest synergy with our commander is Eudora Grave Gardener. This is excellent because whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may return to the battlefield face down under its owner's control. It's a forest land. So what's so perfect about this card is our commander has that great ability whenever the land enters the battlefield, you manifest Dread, and then whenever a second land enters the battlefield, you turn target permanent face up, so that does include lands. So obviously if one of our creatures do die, we could just turn it face up on our side of the battlefield, and then just kind of repeat the process, sacrifice it, have it enter as a land, trigger our commander, repeat the process. So there's probably some combo shenanigans that could take place with this. I'm not 100% sure. All I know is Eudora has great synergy with our commander. But I would say most of all, this deck has a lot of Simic good stuff things going on. It has some great removal options like Beast Within, Counterspell, Reality Shift. A lot of ways to absolutely ramp because of course you are in green. You have Rampant Growth, Cultivate, Explosive Vegetation, and you have a good removal option with it, Azuri's Predation. And it does have 38 lands, which most of them you can't get rid of. Some of them are pretty decent overall. I do like Castle Vantress for the deck. I also like Yavimaya Coast, Hinterland Harbor, Overflowing Bastion. So there is some decent options. Reliquary Tower is another good one. So there, again, it's fine. I feel like if there's anything else that you would add into this deck, it'd be a lot of different lands that fetch for either basics or specific types. So those are some of the reprints. I didn't want to go over the whole entire deck list because you could probably pick and choose which ones you don't want. I would recommend probably taking out a good 20 of these cards because they don't necessarily synergize with your commander, because Duskmourn obviously focuses on landfall, but you really want to be manifesting Dread. There are some options that we can take advantage of, and I'll mention that in the next one. So now let's talk about cards to switch in. There's so many options that you could choose from. Of course, landfall is a big theme in this deck. A simple option would be none other than Avenger of Zendikar. This is pretty much a win con that stands the test of the time, making a bunch of Sapperling tokens, buffing them up with the landfall triggers, and going ahead and swinging in for victory that way. Another option that's a little more expensive but is pretty worth it is Bristly Bill Spine Sower. This will work especially well with Cayenne, and if that's too expensive, which I completely get it, it's a little more expensive than what it should be, you could use another effect like Roaring Earth that will get the job done basically the same with that first effect. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control, so that's perfect. We could buff up our creatures with the landfall triggers. And why not double the triggers of your landfall by using Ancient Green Warden? This is an excellent choice in the deck because it has that ability. You may play lands from your graveyard, so you could reuse those fetch lands that go to the graveyard. And if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So with Duskmourn on the battlefield and Ancient Green Warden, all it really takes is just one land to enter the battlefield to trigger Duskmourn twice, going to that second ability. I will say outside of AC, there's not much ways in the deck where you can play extra lands during your turn, so you will want to add some additional exploration effects. For example, Oracle of Moldiah is pretty cheap right now. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and you can play with the top card of your library revealed and play lands from the top of your library too. This is easily just a great way to constantly make sure we're putting more and more creatures on the battlefield, and hey, we can look at the top card of our library. Our opponents will look at the top card of our library too, but we get that additional benefit. Especially when we're manifesting Dread, we have that option of just looking at the top card. Okay, we want to make sure we just cast that land and then see what's on top of our library the next turn, and then manifest after that. A more recent reprint, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, is another excellent choice. It's another version of those play additional additional lands on each of your turn effects. But on top of that, lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types, so that's perfect. We want to make sure we're utilizing this ability as much as we can to keep manifesting and then cheating big creatures into play. But let's also discuss some cards from the main set. There's some great ones because of course there's a big manifest dread theme. A perfect example from the set would be Hauntwood Shrieker. This has an incredible ability. Whenever it does attack, you manifest dread. You could also pay 1 and a green, reveal target face down permanent. If it's a creature card, you may turn it face up. This is just a backup to Duskmourn because Duskmourn may get hated out a lot because it could cheat in a lot of creatures. This is just another way where we can manifest and also flip over cards for a cheap cost. A card that perfectly synergizes with Duskmourn is Threats Around Every Corner for 3 and a green enchantment. When it does enter, manifest dread. Whenever a face down permanent you control enters, search your library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So whenever we put our land on the battlefield, guess what? We're manifesting with our commander, and that manifested creature enters the battlefield, and hey, we get another land. We could just flip it right over. But why not get some card advantage from flipping our creatures up by using Secret Plans? This increases the toughness of our creatures that are face down by 1, but most importantly, whenever a permanent you control is turned face up, you draw a card. So 2 landfall triggers are essentially going to give you an extra card draw, which will be extra gravy. And if you were building around Duskmourn specifically, you'll want to make sure you have enough big beefy creatures in your deck so that when you flip it up, it's a big effect that will definitely affect the table. Because you are in Simic color combination, there's a lot of big creatures that you could absolutely take advantage of. Here are some of my personal favorites. Koma the Cosmos Serpent is one excellent choice that really takes control of the game. You make Koma coils that are 3/3 at the beginning of each upkeep. That includes your opponent's upkeep, even though the secret lair doesn't say so apparently. Nezahal Primal Tide has a great ability where whenever opponent casts a non-creature spell, you draw a card, and it does protect itself when you discard 3 cards. Plus on top of that, you have no maximum hand size. You might have a lot of cards in your hand, and hey, would you look at that? No, don't have to worry about discarding with this on the battlefield. Going back to the landfall theme, Royal Elemental is quite nuts. That landfall ability, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may gain control of target creature for as long as you control Royal Elemental. This is absolutely nuts. This could be a big giant theft card depending on how much lands enter the battlefield at a time, but I would say the best, and I absolutely mean the best card with the best synergy in your deck would be none other than Kozilek the Broken Reality, because when you cast the spell, up to 2 target players each manifest 2 cards from their hand. For each card manifested this way, you draw a card. Other colorless creatures you control get +3 and +2, and it's a 9/9 body. So this on cast will potentially give you 4 or 2 cards depending on if you target 2 players or just 1 player like yourself, but I would recommend targeting 2 players because you could target yourself and disrupt somebody else's hand. And if you have a lot of face down creatures, well guess what? They're going to be buffed up by +3 and +2. So in some situations you may not want to even flip them up because Kozilek is going to be buffing them up, and plus Kozilek is a 9/9 itself. This is just a great auto include, and honestly it's reasonably cheap, being at $9 or so, so one I'd highly recommend for sure. However, with that said, that's going to do it for me guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on upgrading the Precon product Jumpscare. What cards do you plan on upgrading with this specific deck? I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. Also, if you can, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.